Detective Isaac Holden stood at the edge of Boblin Forest, the wind stirring dead leaves across the barren dirt road. It was late autumn 2002, and the trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to claw at the sky. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself was breathing. Isaac wasn't a man who believed in the supernatural. He had spent over a decade in law enforcement, chasing killers and criminals, not ghosts or monsters. But the case that brought him to Boblin was different. A string of disappearances, all linked to this forest, had grown too large to ignore. Children, hikers, even a few seasoned hunters, gone without a trace. No bodies, no clues, just vanished. Isaac's gut twisted as he ventured deeper into the woods. He had scoured police reports, old case files, but there was nothing concrete. All he had was the gut feeling that the answer lay somewhere within these dark woods. The further he walked, the more unnatural the forest felt. The trees were too close together, their branches interlocking like prison bars. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs beneath his boots. But then, the sound stopped being his own. He paused, listening closely. Someone or something was behind him. He spun around, hand reaching for his sidearm, but there was nothing, just the dense, shadowy thicket. His heartbeat quickened. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but there was something wrong here. He could feel it. A heavy, oppressive presence, like he was being watched, studied. Isaac pushed forward, determined. An hour passed, then another. He reached what the old maps called the Hollow, a large clearing that no one seemed to remember anymore. As he entered, the oppressive atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, his breath now visible in the cold air. In the center of the clearing stood something he hadn't expected, a cabin. It wasn't on any map. It looked old, decrepit, the wood rotting away, but there were signs that someone had been here recently. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Isaac felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the place where everything had gone wrong. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the door. He pushed it open slowly, gun drawn. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Dust hung in the air like mist, illuminated by a single beam of fading daylight through a crack in the wall. Furniture was overturned, claw marks gouged into the walls. Something terrible had happened here. Then he saw it, something lying on the floor in the corner. He approached cautiously, heart in his throat. It was a journal, worn and weathered, the pages stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. Isaac flipped it open. The handwriting was erratic, shaky, as if written in a state of panic. The first few entries were incoherent, ramblings about hearing voices, seeing shadows. But as he read further, the journal told a clearer story. Whoever had written this had stayed in the cabin, trying to uncover the mystery of the disappearances just like Isaac. But something had found them, something in the woods. The writer described waking up in the middle of the night to strange noises, seeing figures moving just beyond the trees, and finally, something standing outside the cabin, watching them. The last entry sent a chill down Isaac's spine. It's here, watching me. It doesn't want to be seen, but it's always watching. I tried to leave, but the forest, it's alive. It won't let me go. If you're reading this, it's too late for you too. You'll never leave. Isaac felt the air in the room shift. He wasn't alone. The floorboards creaked behind him. Slowly he turned, the gun trembling in his hands. The cabin was small. There was nowhere to hide, but the shadow in the corner didn't belong. It was darker than the rest of the room, a deep, suffocating blackness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. His breath caught in his throat. The shape moved, elongating, stepping into the dim light. It wasn't human. Not anymore. Its face was a twisted, elongated mask of stretched skin, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into Isaac's soul. It stood unnaturally tall, its limbs long and thin, almost skeletal, and its breath. It was like a whisper in the wind, a low, rasping sound that chilled him to the bone. Isaac's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He fired his gun, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, but the bullets did nothing. They passed through the creature like smoke, disappearing into the wall behind it. The thing stepped closer, the floorboards groaning beneath its weight, though it seemed to barely touch the ground. Isaac's vision blurred as the oppressive force in the room seemed to press down on him, crushing his chest, suffocating him. He stumbled back, knocking over a chair. His mind raced. There had to be a way out, but the journal had warned him. The forest wouldn't let him leave. Suddenly, the cabin seemed to tilt, the walls warping and bending like a funhouse from hell. Shadows stretched across the floor, crawling towards him. Isaac ran for the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He burst through it, back into the clearing, but the forest was different now. The trees were closing in, twisting and bending, forming a wall around him. The path he had come from was gone, swallowed by the forest. He was trapped. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Isaac spun, his breath ragged. The creature was still there, just beyond the tree line, watching him with those hollow eyes. In a desperate panic, he ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at his skin. But no matter how fast he ran, the forest seemed to stretch on forever, looping back on itself. He wasn't making any progress. The creature was always just behind him, no matter how far he thought he had gone. Finally, exhausted and defeated, Isaac collapsed to his knees in the dirt. His vision swam, darkness closing in. He could hear the whispers now, just like in the journal. Voices from the trees, from the ground, from the very air around him. As the creature stepped into view again, Isaac's last thought was the terrifying realization that he had become just another disappearance in Boblin Forest. But fate had other plans. Suddenly he heard voices, and these voices are his team members, who had been there as a support team for him. Until 4 years, that detective did not forget those incidents, and in 2006 he died because of heart attack. Detective Michael Carter had seen his fair share of strange cases during his 20-year career, but nothing prepared him for the call that came in one chilly October morning in 2002. A man named David Holloway, a local recluse, had been reported missing by his estranged sister. She hadn't heard from him in months and feared something terrible had happened. On its surface, it seemed like another case of a loner disappearing into the fringes of society. But as Michael dug deeper, the details became far more unsettling. David had a reputation in town. Quiet, unassuming, but strange. Neighbors often spoke in hushed whispers about the odd symbols he would carve into the trees around his property, the strange chanting they sometimes heard late at night. Some claimed he was involved in devil worship, though no one could ever prove it. Michael didn't believe in that kind of thing. He'd always thought those were just the ramblings of bored townsfolk with too much time on their hands. The first thing Michael did was visit David's house, a dilapidated old cabin on the outskirts of town. The house was hidden deep in the woods, far away from anyone else. As Michael approached, he felt an odd sense of unease. The air was unnaturally still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The house looked abandoned, its windows dark, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty space inside. No answer. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. Michael drew his flashlight and stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, with the smell of old wood and something else. Something metallic, like blood. His gut tightened, a feeling of dread creeping up his spine. The interior of the cabin was worse than he'd imagined. Dust covered every surface, and the furniture was sparse, almost non-existent. But it was the walls that caught his attention. They were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. Pentagrams, strange runes, and other markings that Michael couldn't identify. It sent a shiver down his spine, but he pushed the unease aside. There had to be a logical explanation for this. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, an old leather-bound book. Michael carefully opened it, flipping through its yellowed pages. It was filled with strange texts, rituals, incantations, drawings of demons. The book was a manual for devil worship, and David had clearly been deep into whatever this was. As Michael continued to search the house, he found a trap door hidden beneath a threadbare rug. He pried it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. The air that rose from below was damp and cold. Michael hesitated for a moment, his flashlight barely penetrating the darkness below, but his sense of duty overpowered his fear. He descended slowly, each creaking step amplifying the sense of dread that clung to him. At the bottom, he found a small underground room. It was crude, with dirt walls and a low ceiling. In the center was a stone altar, stained dark with what he could only assume was blood. Surrounding the altar were more symbols, candles that had long since burned out, and bones, animal, perhaps human, he couldn't tell. Michael's pulse quickened. This wasn't just some delusion. David had been involved in something dark, something real. As he moved closer to the altar, his flashlight flickered and then went out. He cursed under his breath, tapping the flashlight to bring it back to life, but it wouldn't turn on. Then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. It was faint at first, like the sound of wind through the trees, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't English, nor any language Michael had ever heard. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Michael's hand instinctively reached for his sidearm. His legs started shaking as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could feel something in the room with him, something keeping an eye on him, like a tiger keep watching his prey before attacking on it. Suddenly, the air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in. A deep rumbling sound came from beneath the altar. Michael took a step back, his flashlight still dead in his hand. He is trying hard to run, but he couldn't move. It was as if the ground had swallowed his feet, anchoring him to the spot. The whispering turned into a deafening roar, and the ground beneath the altar began to crack. From the darkness, something emerged. A shadowy figure, tall and impossibly thin, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Its face was blur like a dark smoke, lipless mouth that have long, white, sharp teeth, staring at me as if he will tear me into pieces and eat me raw. Michael picked up something and threw it on him, but nothing happened. And then that ghostly figure started laughing as if he is warning me or laughing on my stupid idea. The figure moved toward him, its form shifting, almost liquid, as if it was made of smoke and darkness. The room seemed to warp around it, the walls bending and shivering in ways that it is showing anger. Panic surged through Michael. He had to get out, now. With every ounce of strength he had left, he wrenched himself free from whatever was holding him and ran up the stairs, his legs trembling beneath him. Behind him, he could hear the figure following, its movement slow but feels like someone or something which is very heavy, as if it knew there was no escape. He burst through the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind him, but the whispers continued, growing louder, more frantic. The house itself seemed to pulse with the sound, the walls vibrating as if alive. Michael stumbled out of the cabin and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. But the forest was different now. The trees, once familiar, now seemed alien, twisted into grotesque shapes that loomed over him. It seems like every tree changed themselves into a ghost. The whispers followed him, surrounding him, echoing in his mind. He could feel the presence behind him, watching, waiting. He ran, not stopping until he reached his car. As he fumbled with the keys, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. The shadowy figure stood at the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes locked on him. Michael sped away, his hands shaking on the wheel. But even as he left the forest behind, the whispers remained, scratching at the edges of his mind, a constant reminder that something had followed him. For weeks after the incident, Michael couldn't sleep. The whispers haunted him, growing louder with each passing night. He tried to tell his superiors, but they dismissed his claims, chalking it up to stress or exhaustion. They closed the case, labeling David as a lost cause. But Michael knew better. David hadn't disappeared. He had been taken by something far older and far darker than anyone could imagine.
In the late summer of 1999, Detective Jacob Sterling was sent to investigate a string of missing persons reports tied to the Wineparents Forest, a dense woodland, mysterious forest. This 1 million-acre forest is said to be home to supernatural wanderers. The disappearances, strange as they were, all shared one common detail. The victims had last been seen near an old, abandoned house deep in the forest. Locals claimed the house was cursed, a relic of dark times long past. But Jacob didn't believe in curses, but only facts. The house had stood in the Wineparents for over a century, its origins steeped in mystery. Over the years, it had become a legend. People swore it was haunted, a place where ghosts lingered, and the air itself was heavy with malevolence. But Detective Sterling wasn't easily spooked. He had spent years solving crimes in the city, handling everything from murders to cold cases, and had developed a reputation for being methodical and fearless. On an unusually cool September afternoon, Jacob set out for the forest, determined to put an end to the rumors once and for all. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and a revolver, he followed a faint trail that locals said led to the house. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the thick canopy above blocked out the sunlight, casting the forest floor in an eerie twilight. The air grew colder the closer he got, as if something unnatural was drawing the warmth from the earth itself. Hours passed, and just when Jacob started to doubt the stories, he saw it. A decrepit two-story house looming in a small clearing. The roof sagged, and the wooden walls were cracked and splintered, yet it had an unnerving presence, as though it was waiting for him. The windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch him approach. Jacob hesitated for a moment at the edge of the clearing, feeling a chill creep up his spine. His instincts, honed by years of experience, told him to be cautious, but he wasn't one to turn back from a mystery, especially one that had cost lives. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped into the clearing. As he neared the front porch, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant wail. The air around the house felt wrong, as if it were alive with some invisible force. Jacob's hand hovered over his gun as he reached for the door. It creaked open before he could touch it. The inside of the house was worse than he expected. The smell of rot and mildew filled his nostrils as he entered, and the floorboards groaned beneath his boots. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated by thin rays of light seeping through the cracks in the walls. The house felt abandoned, but not empty. Jacob could feel a presence, something that shouldn't be there. He swept his flashlight across the room, revealing old, decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper. But there was something else. In the center of the room was a large, circular table, and on it lay several photographs. As Jacob approached, his breath caught in his throat. The photos were of the missing people, every one of them. They were arranged neatly, their eyes staring blankly into the camera. A sense of dread gripped him as he realized that the latest photograph, taken most recently, was of a man who had vanished just days before Jacob had been assigned the case. The ink was still fresh. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Jacob froze. The floor above him creaked as if something or someone was moving. He instinctively reached for his revolver, every nerve in his body on edge. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way toward the staircase. Each step up felt heavier than the last. The closer he got to the top, the more oppressive the air became. The temperature dropped further, and he could see his breath in the dim light. As he reached the landing, the footsteps stopped. Before him was a long hallway with several doors, all slightly ajar. At the far end was a larger door, closed and seemingly untouched by time. The atmosphere was thick with an unnatural silence. Summoning his courage, Jacob approached the large door, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached for the handle, the door creaked open on its own, just as the front door had. The room beyond was dark, save for a faint flicker of light coming from a candle on the floor. Inside, the room was barren except for a strange, twisted symbol drawn in chalk on the floor. In the center of the symbol lay an old, leather-bound book, and surrounding the symbol, half hidden in the shadows, stood figures, silent and motionless. Jacob's breath hitched as he realized they weren't human. The figures were pale, with hollow, sunken eyes and skeletal frames. They stood as if frozen in time, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and fear. As his flashlight passed over them, their heads turned in unison, their dead eyes locking onto him. The candle flickered violently, and a cold wind surged through the room. Jacob backed away slowly, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But then something even worse happened. The figures moved. Slowly, deliberately, they began to step toward him, their bones creaking with every motion. The shadows lengthened around them, as if the house itself was coming to life, closing in around him. Jacob turned and bolted down the stairs, the sound of the figures following close behind. His heart raced as he reached the front door and threw it open, bursting out into the cold night air. He didn't stop running until he was far from the house, deep into the forest where the oppressive feeling finally began to lift. It wasn't until he reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, that he looked back. The house was barely visible through the trees, but he could still feel its gaze on him, a lingering malevolence. Jacob left Parents Forest alive, but not unscarred. He never spoke of what he saw inside that house to anyone, and though the case was officially closed, the disappearances stopped. But the house remained, hidden deep in the forest, waiting for the next soul to enter its cursed halls. And Detective Jacob Sterling knew, deep down, that it was far from finished with him. If you know the true name of this forest, then comment down below.